Hey there. Today I'd like to do a brief, unproduced rant about the United Arab Emirates. It's a tiny country that's probably most famous for its fabulously wealthy city-states, Dubai and Abu Dhabi. It is a country that's often lumped in with Saudi Arabia because their foreign policies are very similar. I feel like I have kind of missed the mark on talking about the UAE because the truth is that they're intimately involved in crises throughout the Middle East, and I kind of give them a pass because I'm, well, frankly, quite obsessed with Saudi Arabia. But the thing is that the UAE is more important than Saudi Arabia in some ways because, well, I believe that Saudi Arabia has got about a decade left before its model falls apart. It's entirely possible that the UAE could continue as it is for decades to come. And this is something that we need to focus on a little bit more because the UAE is such a different country from Saudi Arabia. So basically, Saudi Arabia has a ton of wealth, but it's also got a very large population that it has to manage, and that creates difficulties. The UAE doesn't have that large population, but it has wealth. This has allowed the UAE to do a number of things that Saudi Arabia has proven to be incredibly incapable of doing. MBS in Saudi Arabia is very famous for proposing these amazing technical cities and economic diversification, but he's nothing new in Saudi history. There are dozens might overstate it, but there are certainly plenty, there are handfuls of these cities that have been proposed over the decades and never happened. Because the UAE has so much more money compared to the amount of people it has been able to build cities like Dubai and Abu Dhabi that have real companies that compete on the world stage and has actually managed to do real diversification. There's some debate over how serious it is, but there's no question that Dubai and Abu Dhabi are a much bigger economic deal than Neom in Saudi Arabia or the King Abdullah Technical City or whatever the one the last king was doing and the kings before that. Another thing that the UAE has managed to do that Saudi Arabia has never done is actually create a real military power. It has famously been referred to by Jim Mattis, Trump's first Secretary of Defense, as the little Sparta of the Middle East. The UAE, again, because it doesn't have this large, poor population that it's terrified of the way that Saudi Arabia does, was able to build a real military. It was able to trust its military. With Saudi Arabia, the Saudi royal family has never wanted to build up a real military. They've paid billions and billions and billions and billions of dollars for weaponry, but they don't trust the military establishment within Saudi Arabia enough because they're terrified of military coups. The UAE, for some reason that I can't point to exactly, doesn't have that problem. I think it has to do with its lower population and the fact that most people with a UAE passport are comprehensively bribed or just massively independently wealthy themselves. So the UAE was more serious about building up a military, and it has real military weight. You can see this in Yemen if you contrast the way that Saudi Arabia just, hires mercenaries and bombs things, while the UAE, it also hires some mercenaries, but actually has its own special forces, has its own real military contingent on the ground. So these two aspects actually make these aspects, the real economic diversification and the fact that the UAE may last as a country for decades to come and continue to build power, that combined with its effective military force actually in some ways make it a very interesting ally for the United States. And this would be true. This is the way that Mattis talks about them. This is the way that Washington, D.C. often talks about them. This would be very true that the UAE actually is a useful, maybe not ally, but sort of fellow traveler, a friend of the United States, if the UAE was doing anything positive. If we had a real Cold War going on, then yeah, the UAE would be a great country to work with. Unfortunately, we don't. And the UAE is working very hard to get the United States to follow its agenda. rather than this tiny, tiny country helping to further the U.S. agenda. The UAE's actions in places like Yemen and Libya aren't just anti-Yemeni and Libyan, they're anti the interests of the world. The UAE is working quite hard to ensure that Arab democracy is a thing that never happens. That's the consistent through line of UAE policy. And the extent to which we haven't been paying attention to that, both on this channel and more broadly, is a real problem. Because while we've focused on the more ridiculous, absurd, outsized disasters of Saudi foreign policy, we've sort of missed how the UAE has been working its way through Middle East politics over the past decade, and more importantly, the way that it's been working its way through Washington, D.C. in a really sinister way. Saudi Arabia wants to massacre dissidents in consulates. The UAE wants to work to really undermine democracy, not just in the Middle East, but also in the United States as well. The thing that finally prompted me, well, there's two news stories that finally prompted me to talk a little more about the UAE. One came out this past week, which talked about how Erik Prince, the Blackwater guy, it seems very clear that he was violating UN sanctions in Libya. And it's quite disturbing because this story came out based on a United Nations report, and it's pretty clear that we're not going to do anything about it. Because Erik Prince, this Blackwater guy, over the course of decades, or rather the U.S. government, isn't going to do anything about it. Erik Prince, this guy, and a whole mess of other sort of influence web, a whole web of influence in Washington, D.C. And throughout the United States and the world is becoming progressively more and more immune to democratic input from the United States and just sort of general regulatory power of anything in international law and U.S. law. And the UAE is helping to make that happen. I mean, the United Arab Emirates is dramatically smarter than Saudi Arabia. They're not just pissing their money away on PR trips the way that Saudi Arabia does. They're actually making things happen in ways that are quite sinister, I believe, and really do undermine the United States in serious ways. Like, we do not need in the United States to have this sort of, I mean, people talk about the deep state a lot, and I think, or the blob, and I think it's an established problem in the United States that we have a permanent foreign policy apparatus that thinks it knows better. These defense contractors and all these issues around the old Cold War, the war on terror, and now the new Cold War with China. But I think what the UAE and its wealth makes possible is another layer of sleaziness, and something that actually gets us into the realm where some of these conspiracy theories that are so laughable, both on the right and the left, begin to become a little more real. In specifically the figure of Erik Prince, that Blackwater guy. It's real creepy stuff, and it's the way that it's playing out in Yemen is something that I've ignored, I think, with my obsession with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has pretty straightforward imperialist goals in Yemen. They don't like the Houthi group that is in charge of the country and has been, or rather in charge of the majority of the country and has been for 5 or 6 years. They're trying to defeat them. But the UAE also, up until 2019, was working against the Houthis, but seemed a little more concerned in working against political parties that deigned to try to mix Islam and democracy. So it's fascinating. I didn't really appreciate this until I read a recent article by Iona Craig. I'll link it in the description here, and you should read it in depth. I didn't quite realize the extent to which the UAE was working directly against the interests of the Saudi coalition the entire time. So even if you're somebody who thinks the Saudi war in Yemen is worthwhile, even if you're someone who's who thinks that somehow we're confronting Iran there. Even if that's the case, then you want to be concerned about what the UAE is doing. It's really quite staggering, just what a mess the UAE is capable of contributing to. I'd always sort of thought to myself, well, the UAE, they're the smarter actors. They're the more the actors that are more likely to have some longevity there, and I've just never really thought about them that much. But it's become clear in recent months, clearer to me in recent months, that I shouldn't see their influence as being as benign. And to the extent that Saudi Arabia has been, and the UAE have been successful in the decades since the Arab Spring in crushing democracy in the Arab world, I think it's largely been the UAE doing that. It ain't great. Another news story that I'll also link in the description that came up in recent weeks is the revelation from Ro Khanna, one of my favorite congressmen. He is a congressman from California who's really been leading the charge in trying to end the U.S. involvement in the war in Yemen. And one of the most extraordinary things I've honestly ever read, this might come off as a little too jingoistic or U.S. patriotic, but Ro Khanna, in an interview, said that the UAE ambassador had come into Ro Khanna's office and thought it was appropriate to shout at a U.S. congressman because of his opposition to the war in Yemen. An ambassador from this sort of Middle East satrapy that I'd never really thought about as being that big a deal, thought he could come in to the office of a U.S. congressman and shout at him and belittle him and treat him like he was some kind of servant. And there's something very out of whack with Washington, D.C., and this is something that I'm always alluding to, but I think what I need to do a better job of is separating out the strands of Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Because Saudi Arabia, fundamentally, the way that it uses its power is often very, very stupid. And the ways that the UAE uses its power are not. As I've emphasized before, I mean, the UAE has essentially won the war in Yemen. It has power over Yemeni islands. It has fairly significant power over Aden, Yemen's largest port, which is controlled by forces that I think, have, of course, their own independent merit and power, but I think can fairly also be seen as, to some extent, UAE proxies. So it's just, I don't know, it's something that I felt like it was worth marking. Also a way to get a video out in a somewhat discombobulated week on my part personally. But yeah, that's something to really keep in mind, because I've been clear for years that I don't believe that Saudi Arabia is going to survive the 2020s under its current system. I mean, Arabia will endure. Honestly, Aramco, the oil company, will endure, but I don't believe it'll still be Saudi Arabia. The UAE has everything it needs to continue being a force in the Middle East for decades to come. And I think at this point, the UAE seems to think that it can order the United States around. And that is untenable. That is not a situation that can last. I'm perfectly happy with a UAE that lasts forever, if it is acting for the betterment of the region and, to a lesser extent, serving U.S. goals. Yeah, I think as of today, I think it's fair to say and worth pointing out that the United Arab Emirates is a bit of a problem, and I hope to pay more attention to that. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe. I think in the coming months, I'll be a little better situated, and we'll start seeing a lot more carefully produced videos. So thanks for watching. Please subscribe, and if you click on the bell next to the subscribe button, you will get notifications whenever I upload a new video. Thanks.